Welcome back. This is our 8th week. So in this week, we are going to study unsupervised learning. We will first look at why we want to study unsupervised learning and what is unsupervised learning. Then we will study one of the most fundamental unsupervised learning methods for dimensionality reduction called principal component analysis, or PCA. And then we will study PCA in more detail, and then move on to another fundamental unsupervised learning task called clustering. And we will study both k-means clustering and spectral clustering. And finally, we will study a deep learning model for unsupervised learning called autoencoder. So why we want to study unsupervised learning? In machine learning, we can broadly categorize machine learning models into supervised learning or unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is what we have studied so far, including regression and classification. And in this lecture, we are going to study unsupervised learning, including dimensionality reduction and clustering. So the difference between supervised learning and unsupervised learning is in supervised learning, each data point has a label. So whether it's a class label or it is a label of a desired outcome. But in unsupervised learning, there's no labels for the data. And as we mentioned, two fundamental tasks is dimensionality reduction and clustering. So we can understand these two tasks better by looking at the kind of output this model is generating, and also compare with supervised learning. If we have discrete output like 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D, in supervised learning, this is called classification, right? So we classify the data points into different classes, and the discrete output is the class label. And in unsupervised learning, when we have discrete outputs, we are doing clustering. We cluster the data points into different clusters so that each data point will have a cluster label, which is a discrete output. And suppose we have continuous output. Then in supervised learning, we are dealing with the regression problem to predict a value, a continuous value, typically. But in unsupervised learning, when we have continuous output, we are doing dimensionality reduction. And also the difference is typically we are having multiple outputs rather than just a single continuous output. So this is a nice summary of the fundamental tasks in machine learning by looking at the output, whether it's discrete or continuous, or the task is supervised and unsupervised. And it will help us to make connections between what we learned in this lecture and what we learned in previous lectures. So let us look at dimensionality reduction first. This is a very simple example of dimensionality reduction from 2 dimension to 1 dimension. So here is the data. Is a relatively high dimension, but it's not typically what we call about it high dimension, but it's just a 2 dimension, as it's a higher dimension. Then we, in dimensionality reduction, we reduce the higher dimension to a lower dimension, for example, from 2-dimensional to 1-dimensional. What that means is this illustration here, for example, we have a 2-dimensional data with x1 and x2. So these are the data points in a 2D plane. And to reduce the dimension to 1 means we reduce the representation of the data from a plane, from a 2D plane, to a line, to a 1-dimensional space, which is a line. So the data points will be represented by a single number rather than 2 numbers. So why do we want to study dimensionality reduction to reduce the dimension from high dimensional space to low dimensional space? The fundamental reason is so-called the curse of dimensionality. So this is a fundamental challenge for machine learning. This is talking about the phenomenon that when we are in low dimensional space, it is relatively easy to tell data apart. In this illustration here, we look at this one of the simplest classifier called nearest neighbor classifier. So in 1-dimensional space, you can differentiate your nearest neighbor and neighbors that are far away very easily. And when we go to 2-dimensional space, it is relatively more difficult to tell the nearest neighbor. Basically, you have more nearest neighbors of the same or similar distance in a 2D space. And if we move on to 3D space, the space become exponentially large. And here in this example, there are basically 64 regions that is divided into a region by unit 5. For example, here is 4 regions, here is 16. And then here is 4 to the power of 3, which is 64 regions. In this case, a particular point have even more nearest neighbors. And imagine we go to even higher dimensional space, for example, 100 or 1000 dimensional space. In that huge space, basically every point has to have similar distance to each other because the dimension is very high and there are lots of regions to put data points in each cell. Right, so that is the curse of dimensionality. So in high dimensional space, it's more difficult to deal with the data, to differentiate the data. So that is the fundamental reason for dimensionality reduction. Another reason is in real data, we often have redundancy. That is, there are repeated or redundant information in our data, and we would like to reduce the redundancy or reduce the correlations between data points. And another reason is sometimes we want to visualize the data, to take a look at the data, what does it look like? And due to our fundamental limitation in our human visual system, we can only digest a low-dimensional visualization. So let us look at some handwritten digits from the USPS dataset, which is with some examples shown over here. The size of each digit image is 64 times 57. And they are very simple binary images. That is, each pixel has only one bit. It's a black and white image. But it's very small, but in the binary image space of this size, there are much more than just this digit. So one question is, how many possible images of this size of 64 times 57 and this bit depth, which is just 1 bit per pixel? So please pause the video and think about it and write down your answer. So this is the answer. So in this image space of size 64 times 57, and each pixel has only 1 bit, that is 2 possible values, there are 2 to the power 3,648 possible images. You may put this into your calculator, and it is basically infinity. And let us look at a face image which is of a size 100 by 100. And this time, we are not having a binary image, but a grid level image with 256 grid levels, that is 8 bits. So basically, an 8-bit image. And we can imagine to map or project this face into an image space of the same size and same bit level. Imagine there's an image space of 100 times 100, that is 10,000. Suppose there's a huge space with 10,000 coordinates, right? So with 10,000 coordinates, and then this one image, right, will become just a point in that 10,000 imaging space, right? In that, if we have 10,000 coordinates in a huge space, then this image with 10,000 values will become just a point, right? A point, at that point have 256 possible values. And we can imagine that all our human faces are similar, and in that space of the 100 times 100, they are likely to lie close to each other and form a face subspace. And because in that huge space, what we have from previous calculation is 256 to the power of 10,000 possible image, right? So our human face images are just a tiny fraction of this number of possible images. And we know that face images have certain characteristics, and they should be similar, and there should be a subspace that contains all the face images. So the objective of dimensionality reduction is to find a subspace, a lower dimensional representation that can represent our desired data points. So we want to find low dimensional subspace, or we can also call it a manifold, right? So the reason is for high dimensional data with structure, typically there's fewer variations than the actual dimension. This is what we talk about, the redundancy. And therefore, we assume the data to live on a lower dimensional manifold. And therefore, we will deal with such data, high dimensional data, by looking for a lower dimensional embedding, or we also call it projection or transformation, right? So embedding, projection, or transformation, they mean the same thing in the context of dimensionality reduction, right? For example, a set of 3D data points may just lie on a 2D plane, and more complicated data may just lie on this is a switch row data points, which lies on a single manifold. So that is why we want to do one of the fundamental unsupervised learning tasks called dimensionality reduction. And in the next session, we will look at the most fundamental model for this task called principal component analysis, or PCA.